Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems for its U.S. Elections Program 2020, and in particular for joining today's panel. My name is Ashley Law, and I'm the Youth Specialist at IFES, and I'll be moderating today's event with three amazing panelists. We're joined by Madelaine Reis, a student disability advocate at American University in Washington, D.C. Madelaine is also the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Health Advocacy Summit, which is a nonprofit that empowers young adults with chronic and rare diseases through advocacy efforts. Lee Jackson is also part of our panel. He's the Director of the Leadership Institute's Youth Leadership School, where he trains young people to be active political leaders. And we're also joined by Honorable Amanda Masono, one of the newest elected members to join the 4th Autonomous Bougainville Government House of Representatives in Papua New Guinea. It's very nice to see you again, Amanda. Before we get started, I'd like to note that IFES is a 501c3 organization funded in part by the US government. We have a bipartisan board of directors and a nonpartisan organizational identity. And as most of you know, we provide apolitical democracy and elections assistance. This work is made possible by the generous support of the American people through the United States Agency for International Development and other supporters. The content associated with this event does not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or our sponsors, nor do the opinions expressed reflect the views or opinions of IFES. So, with the election just a few days away, we've already seen an increase in youth voter turnout, especially in some of the most critical states, such as Texas, where we've seen the youth vote has increased already by more than 600% compared to 2016, the last presidential election. And in Florida, where the youth vote is 4 times what it was in 2016. And so we anticipate this year that there's a higher voter or youth voter turnout, and this is why many political analysts are calling 2020 the year of the young. And obviously, we're already seeing a shift in the voting bloc to voters under 40, as there's been a huge increase in youth registration, activism, and engagement since 2016 and since the 2018 midterm elections. We're also seeing an incredible uptick in individual and collective youth activism, and this is being shown through large-scale social movements and demonstrations. And all of these factors could really lead to young people being a tremendous political force in terms of the outcome of the US election next week. So for this panel, we want to discuss youth participation from a comparative lens to the Asia-Pacific region, where 60% of the population is between ages 15 and 24. And so before we kick off the panel, I'd like to ask IFES's Regional Director for the Asia-Pacific region, Vasu Mohan, to sort of set the stage for this global conversation. Vasu?
Thank you, Ashley. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, particularly to those who are joining us from the Asia-Pacific region. From Afghanistan in the West to Fiji in the Pacific, IFES works with institutions and people who strive to strengthen democracy in their societies. We are particularly excited about this youth panel because about 60% of the Asia-Pacific region is 15 to 24 of age, and therefore there's a lot to learn and share about the role of young people in creating democracies. So I started working at IFES 19 years ago as a youth myself. And throughout my career, I've seen so many excellent examples of young people who are at the forefront of democratic change in their societies. A few instances come to mind. I remember IFES being engaged with young voters in Sri Lanka and who, through a campaign involving over 400,000 people, called to reform the Sri Lanka's voter registration process and allowed for, thousands of 18-year-olds who were disenfranchised from the electoral process to ultimately be able to vote. They got a bill passed in parliament. In Afghanistan, university-age youth started debate clubs as a way to develop leadership skills. Now, even more closer in time, November 8th, Myanmar has elections, and there will be over 5 million new first-time voters, all youth, in these elections. And in Bangladesh, the Students Against Violence Everywhere program, it's a university student program with over 1,000 students in 10 universities who are really looking for alternate resolutions to violent conflict that plague our societies. And of course, from the Pacific region, you will hear from Amanda Masono, one of the newest elected members of the Bougainville House of Representatives, who's on this panel. You know, in the Asia Pacific region and around the world, youth are at the forefront of democratic and social justice movements. We see this in every country, developed, established democracies to new emerging democracies. And I really look forward to hearing from all of our panelists and thinking about youth participation, both from the lens of US elections next week and also beyond that in a global sense. So welcome. We look forward to spending the next hour discussing this really interesting topic. So I'll turn it back to Ashley to kick off today's discussion.
Thank you, Vasu. As I said earlier, our panelists and I will be discussing their personal experiences and some strategies and recommendations for engaging young people in the electoral process, both in the US and abroad. At any point throughout this session, I invite you to submit questions via the Zoom chat function for me to ask the panelists later on. So let's get started. Lee, I'd like to ask you our first question. What motivated you to become engaged in politics and community issues? And at what age do you think young people should become engaged in civic and political life?
That's a great question, Ashley, and thank you for having me this evening. For me, I started just with different clubs and organizations when I was in middle school and high school. And then after I graduated high school, when I was in college, I still wanted to be involved in my home community. And I actually felt there was a disconnect between my local school board, so the governing body that oversees our schools and our community. So for me, it just was the next natural step. To run and to serve on my local school board and to serve local office. And then it just since continued from there. I'm a big fan. I was a summer camp counselor back in the day for 3 or 4 summers in a row. And we had something called the buddy system. So if you went somewhere, you always had a buddy. And that was something that I brought with me when I started working on campaigns. And as a campaign manager, my rule was, you know, if you're 12 years old, you're old enough to knock doors with a buddy or things like that, or talk to other voters. And as a campaign manager or someone who's been on professional political campaign staff, I would always go out of my way to make sure I found young people to help out with my campaign events. They seem to me, they always have the most energy. They're some of our best volunteers. And people are more likely to talk to them because sometimes they just think they're selling Girl Scout cookies. But hey, I'll take it either way.
That's great, Lee. Thank you. I was also a summer camp counselor, so I appreciate that. Madelaine, what do you think? Is there a time that's too early or an age that you think is more opportune to sort of pave the way for more lifelong political participation habits within young people?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I started very young. I started knocking doors when I was about 2 years old for the local Democratic Party in my town. My mom got me involved. I guess it was the only way to get me to take a nap afterwards. So I got involved really early. I loved being involved in local politics. Though I didn't do it as much in high school, I decided to study it instead. I think the best time to really get involved, though, was when I was 16. I'm looking at what I want to do with my future, and I've always had this love for politics, and I'm looking at colleges, and it was a very instrumental time for me to make that leap into politics, and so I got very heavily involved. But I think for me, what became really life-changing was I'm very into like an issue-based politics. So when my own health became the issues that I was fighting for, that really is when political engagement became center stage for me.
Thanks, Madelaine. I think This is what I think we're seeing right now with a lot of young people is issue-based politics. So that makes, a lot of good sense. Amanda, we talked in Tuesday's panel with another group of panelists about the issue of lowering the voting age. And so I wonder what's your take on, the need to lower the voting age as a sort of mechanism to increase youth participation. What are your thoughts about that?
I still think that the voting age should be 18 as it stands, going with the international recognized age as the age 18 as the allowable voting age for young youth to participate, especially from the Pacific and one of the Pacific Island countries, Papua New Guinea, where you have a high rate of illiteracy for young, not only young youth, but for all the population as a whole. So it would mean you have people who young youths who are not really versed with the government who would be voting, and that would be having people who are not youths that are not well informed to vote in issues of government and democracy as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I think, sometimes youth participation, like Madelaine said, is, based on community issues, right? That motivate young people to engage. And so, as Vasu mentioned as well, in the US and across the globe, we've seen a huge rise in youth-led social movements that highlight a variety of important issues to young people. Some of these issues include aspects of human rights, climate change, for example, which seem to be shared priorities across party lines. Lee, have you noticed other interest areas driving youth-led movements, and do you think these advocacy efforts really impact politics?
Definitely, for sure. I will say when we just look at American history throughout, any sort of drastic and much needed social change, if it didn't start on a college campus, it definitely, the backbone of it at a time was on a college campus or somewhere near there. And I definitely think for this generation, or definitely between the Zoomers and the millennials, we are seeing an increase of them saying enough is enough and demanding a change or changes for issues that are really important to them. I myself was at multiple protests this summer, and I think just with so many activities and everything going on, in a sense, it's kind of always in your face. And that is naturally led to people being hyper aware of the issues and hyper aware of how important this upcoming election is. And if you're willing to go march for a couple hours or to organize voter registration drives and things like that, people are definitely willing to take the time it needs to go check off a box and vote.
Yeah, Lee, I totally agree with you, and you mentioned campus politics. And so, Madelaine, I'd like to turn it over to you as a student activist yourself. Have you noticed any specific strategies to engage young people that seem to have more of an impact than others? And in particular, for marginalized groups, such as young people with disabilities or young women?
I just think making those issues known. What I was able to do in undergrad by creating events around the issues I'm trying to focus on, and creating events that are more educational about those issues rather than trying to drive them in to join me. It was more based on educating them about that issue. I held a movie night where we talked about disability in Hollywood. I had trainings around how to get accommodations in college, and it was a great way to bring people into the disabilities rights movement on campus and for young people. And I find that strategy still works with a lot of other organizations that I've been connected with. it's definitely gotten very more interesting now that I'm in graduate school and in Washington, D.C., and I'm on one of the most politically engaged campuses in the country. So I've definitely learned other strategies and how to use the school newspaper, how to use the faculty and professors, and how to also coalition build with other groups on campus in order to build a stronger movement.
Yeah, those are some great strategies, Madelaine, that you mentioned. You know, drawing in some allies and coalition building is always a great tactic. I think too, we've noticed across the world actually that university campuses sort of seem to be a space in which it's okay to talk about some of these more sensitive issues. So I appreciate you sharing that. Amanda, you know, as a recently elected member of parliament, and of course, as a previous member of an election management body, the Bougainville Referendum Commission, you know, what did you find to be key motivators for young people to get involved in elections?
From experience, since I worked with the Bougainville Referendum Commission, some of the key motivators for getting young people to be involved in elections is basically allowing them to take part in the electoral process itself, having them to be engaged as temporary electoral workers in going out to assisting the polling teams, and also during counting process, where they actually engage and participate in those processes, but also going out as engaged as observers of the process and seeing how elections are being carried out. Another thing is another key motivating factor would be to also involve them in civic education, where they are informed, because I believe that a well-informed population or youth population makes a key difference in them valuing the elections, and also the issues that the country and the world is faced with, that are central key, or that become key issues are important to every individual youth. So also in region like Bougainville, where I'm from, having when the electoral body and the government recognizes the participation of youth in the elections, and having providing for an environment which is free and conducive for youth to participate and also vote in the referendum and in other elections, makes a whole lot difference in encouraging youth to participate in any issues of the government and also the elections.
Great, thank you, Amanda. You know, you mentioned poll workers, and I'd like to sort of tease that out a bit more. You know, in the US, we're seeing a lot of young people come out and work at polling locations. And so I'm wondering, Amanda, did you happen to see an increase in younger Bougainvillians coming out to support as poll workers on election day?
Yes, for this year's 2020 elections and last year's Bougainville referendum had a very high turnout of youth, you know, taking ownership of the process, and I have never seen such a situation in Papua New Guinea, especially in Bougainville as a whole, where youth are starting to step in and be part of the process, seeing the significance of their involvement prior to that during the referendum, because it was a vote on Bougainville's political future, and youths see it as, you know, a better future for Bougainville in the coming years, and also for this year, 2020, because of the transition period that Bougainville is going through, and youth seeing better access to education, better access to job opportunities. This time around, the 2020 election, ABG general elections, had enormous youth participation where
It seems we might have lost audio for Amanda in Bougainville. But I think it's wonderful to hear, with the latest, with the last election in Bougainville, which I believe were just a few months ago, to hear that there's been an increase in youth participation. I think this is sort of the global trend we're seeing, right? And so, voting is absolutely important on election day. I think we've also established that non-formal methods of participation and advocacy are extremely important as well. In the last couple of years, there has been an incredible surge of young people registering to vote, but we don't yet know how this is going to translate in terms of the overall youth voter turnout. Now, certainly we're seeing that, there are high rates of youth voter turnout in terms of early voting, but what's the overall youth turnout going to look like? Madelaine, I'd like to ask you, in light of the COVID pandemic, what might be some of the challenges to engaging young people in elections right now? And how have you seen young people be resilient and overcome these challenges that they're facing in order to get their voices out there and to vote?
I think some of the issues young adults are facing are just trying to understand their other options to vote. We've had to do a lot of voter education around early voting, absentee voting, and what that looks like and how you can accomplish that in your state. But young adults have been so resilient, and because of social media and the great internet connections we can create, it's been really easy to create groups online and talk with other young activists about how we are, working in each state to make sure that this youth voter turnout does turn out. And it's definitely been difficult to try and create all of the types of training that you might do in person at a college to translate that onto the internet. But I think because of, platforms like Zoom and some of the great apps that we have now, like Slack and stuff like that, has made it much easier to make sure that everyone is educated on how to vote.
Yeah, I think that's, absolutely what we're seeing is, digital activism. Lee, I wonder from your perspective, from the training perspective, have you seen sort of an uptick in digital or SMS voter registration drives or other online mechanisms to sort of get out the vote this year?
Oh, for sure. And I would say it started long before get out the vote. So my full-time job, my day job, every single day, I wake up and figure out how do I train more young conservative activists to be involved in the public policy process. And we focus on something called political technology. And those are all the tools and the tricks that you need as a cause or a campaign to be successful. And it's my job, and I guess the best way to think about it is I work with students, young professionals, whether they're in America or at the Leadership Institute. We actually have an international training department, a really strong one. But I see it as I train my students and give them a toolbox and give them every single tool that we are aware of that we consider to be effective. And every campaign is different and every election year is different. So I always tell my students, well, it's your job to go into your toolbox and figure out which tools are the best for the situation that you're facing. Usually I talk about time constraints and budget constraints, but this year I'm talking about really COVID. So it's been less of maybe door knocking in communities and tabling on campus, but maybe there's a lot more this year. We're seeing a lot of peer-to-peer text messaging. That's something that I've been teaching quite a bit, that I know a lot of groups in America are doing, or sometimes maybe we even get everybody on a Zoom call and we watch a movie while we all make calls for our favorite candidate. So COVID has definitely forced some new innovation and required a lot of campaigns and a lot of people who teach political technology to re-examine the tools that are in our toolbox. But for me, I think it's an opportunity to grow our personal skills and strength and really question that we're making the right decisions and we're here for the right reasons.
Yeah, that's great, Lee. And I feel silly. I haven't heard this before, political technology, but obviously that's what it is in this sense. But I would be remiss if I didn't sort of bring up the digital divide, right? So Madelaine, maybe I'll come back to you. Some of these online and social media platforms are not always accessible to all users. And so I wonder, what are some of the other tactics that maybe don't rely so much on the internet, or what are some ways to make these online tools more accessible?
So sometimes we actually try to do conference calls because social media might not be accessible to most people with visual impairments, the blind, or any other disability that might make processing hard. So we do a lot of conference calls. We also, as old school as it sounds, at least within the disability community, sometimes we still do mailers and things like that. But it's been a very difficult thing to navigate, especially now that they're also making digital ballots for people with disabilities, because we're definitely noticing that digital divide, not just with social media, but in the disability community with internet access or printer access to print out that digital ballot. And so we're trying to train people in ways on how to go to the polls and do maybe voting on car side or using the technology in a polling station because other options aren't accessible to them. We are also making a really strong effort to make our social media accessible. We include image descriptions, alt text. We make sure all of our graphics and stuff are in certain color contrasts, so it works for people with visual impairments. We also make sure, there's captions on all our videos. And we just kind of hope that that information get out there. We do find that though not everyone might not have internet access, we're finding that a lot of people do have at least access to a smartphone. And so we've also made it so we make sure a lot of our content is user-friendly on a cell phone and in that display. We also make sure that any type of content we print out, and if we are mailing things, they're in an accessible format. So, that's maybe Arial font, size 14, and just trying to make sure that everything's accessible for everyone, and making things as clear as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Madelaine. Those are some great ways to make voter education more accessible and just make the political process more accessible for everyone. I see we have Amanda back. Amanda, we've been sort of talking about digital tools and the digital divide. And so, from the Bougainville perspective, we'd love to hear, you mentioned young Bougainvillians being involved in voter education initiatives. So what were some of these voter education outreach methods that you saw work really well in the latest election?
Some of the voter education methods would be, coming from still establishing democracy as compared to a well-developed, established democracy in other parts of the countries. We have, online methods of voter education still really at a low stage, very low stage here in
but I would be remiss if I didn't.
More the voter education methods that we used was basically aware used by polling officials, not polling officials, but electoral officials to conduct to communities through face-to-face. Another method would be Facebook's social media. Social media has been a challenge because of the internet access internet here in Papua New Guinea as a whole. So these are the issues that Papua New Guinea and Bougainville is still faced with when it comes to online access, both education. So we're basically stuck doing the old school methods, talking face to face, and radios and awareness methods.
Yeah, and Amanda, it's funny you say old school, but I think some of those techniques are some really effective strategies at times, especially in terms of creating a community. So thank you for sharing that. And Lee, I have one question I skipped over since we had Amanda join us, but for those who maybe aren't aware, the Pew Research Center reports that Generation Z, so voters from 18 to 23, are more racially and ethnically diverse than older generations. And so, Lee, I'm curious to know, what do you think about this level of diversity and how it might impact voter turnout? And then I would like to ask Madelaine the same question.
That's a really great question. To be honest with you, I know it's going to have an impact. I think it's safe to say it's going to have an impact, but I don't know what that turnout is going to be just yet. And I know earlier we talked about more young people are voting than ever before, but the share of young people voting is actually continuing to increase. So I think partnering that with this just younger generation being more ethnically diverse, I think we have started to see that a little bit, whether it was a demand for criminal justice reform and some other things that might jumpstart some of the issues that have been talked about for a while, for decades, but we haven't seen change. But specific changes, I can't tell you, but I will say, as someone who follows elections closely, I'm really interested to see what the data says post-election day.
Yeah, me too, Lee. Madelaine, same question. How do you think the level of diversity of Generation Z voters this year is going to impact the outcome of the election?
Mute. Hello. Sorry, I was on mute. I agree with a lot of what Lee was saying, and I really am also interested in seeing the data when it comes out. At least from a disability voter perspective, we're really excited to kind of see how our youth engagement turns out, especially now that we know that like 20% of young adults in colleges have a disability. And so I think because people are so much more comfortable with their identities and understand how those identities translate into policy issues nowadays, it's definitely going to be interesting. And I think it's going to be very insightful to see how we turn out as a generation.
Yeah, I mean, next week is going to be very exciting. Thinking about the sort of global perspective of this conversation, I know we have quite a few folks in the Pacific Island region who are in our audience today. And I want to sort of talk about, are there any good practices or lessons learned as it pertains to youth participation in political life that you have found particularly impactful that you would like to highlight with not only election administrators that we have in the audience, but also other young leaders, leaders of civil society organizations or youth groups? And Amanda, I'll start with you. What, if any, what sort of good example or lesson learned or piece of advice would you offer to young leaders in the audience today?
Sorry, Ashley, could you come again?
Yeah, so Amanda, I was just asking, if there are any good practices, good examples, lessons learned that you would want to convey to other young leaders who are in the audience or other election administrators in the audience.
I think for us, some of the lesson learned would be to actually for Bougainville as a whole. For Bougainville, we would like to get more youth participate in elections through civic education, and also actually encouraging the youth movements that you've mentioned earlier, because right now we're still at a developing democracy states where a lot of things are prettily centered around our cultural norms and the religions and basically the government system. So what we want to do is engage women and young women and men to participate as early as possible in political issues, and also understanding the roles of elections, so that they can be well versed with the issues and also participate in those activities.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And same question to you, Madelaine.
Sure. I think just piggyback off of what Amanda said, we want to really get the youth involved. And I think, great ways to do that would just be starting voter registration drives at high schools and colleges. Those are some of the best practices. When I was registering people to vote in Florida, you can actually start registering people to vote at 16. And that's a great way to get young adults and young people involved in voting. And I think you also have to include civic education along with that, as well as just teaching people different methods of voting and other political ways to get involved in the voting process.
Great, thanks, Madelaine. And Lee?
Sure. So I think for me, my job at the Leadership Institute is I teach a 2-day, 30-hour class that answers this question. So I'm going to do the best that I can to boil it down. If you're in an outside organization trying to reach young people, we have this saying, if you want to hunt ducks, you got to go where the ducks are. So if you want to reach young people, you have to go where young people are. And usually that's on a college campus. Lately, it's been digitally. So if you're an outside organization and you want to hunt ducks, you got to go where the ducks are. If you are a young leader listening now, I'm going to give you kind of 2 tips of advice that I try to share with all of my students. The first one is, you owe it to your philosophy to learn how to win. Being right in the sense of being correct on an issue is not enough to win. So you owe it to yourself to learn these skills and the political technology that I talked about earlier to make sure your side can keep advancing, can keep going forward. The second thing that I want to mention that we talk about quite a bit in the Leadership Institute is to always be growing and building your organization. I talk about getting as many people involved. We teach at LI, give them a title and get them involved. Titles are free, give them something to do, and always be growing your organization. Because if you're not growing as an organization, you're dying as an organization. And success over time, whether it's this election, 5 elections down the road, 10 elections down the road, the side that has a larger, well-trained organization is going to be the side that wins.
Thanks, Lee. Those are some great tips, and I appreciate you condensing what sounds like a lot into just sort of 1-2 minutes. So these are, all of our pre-prepared questions, and I appreciate you all sharing your experiences and insights. And we have received some very great questions from the audience. So I'd like to jump into those now. One of them is around political representation of young people. And, I think we can all agree that formally political youth representation is quite low across the world, right? So it's, 2% of young people are members of parliament globally. What sort of strategies or what might be some words of motivation to encourage young people to, to stand for election and run for elections and become members of parliament? Amanda, maybe we'll start with you on this one. You spoke a little bit about sort of what motivated you to become, to run for member of parliament, but for the Bougainville House of Representatives, maybe you could expand a bit on that and how in other countries we might be able to encourage young people to participate in the formal process this way.
Thank you, Ashley. We in Bougainville, I'm going to talk on our case. In Bougainville, this year's election has seen a lot of young, both women and young men contesting the elections. Basically, they have seen the issues that are faced in the country as a whole with in access to education and job opportunities. And a lot of times they have seen that they have not been participating in the process as a whole, rebuilding the region. So those issues that youths were advocating on and the government has not taken on board has collectively brought the youths together to actually endorsing their own candidates to contest the elections. And that's why you will see a handful of people in Bougainville, the Bougainville House of Representatives who are young because of the fact that youth want to participate in the decision-making process, and they have supported those candidates to ensure that their voice are heard in Parliament. So that is what I've seen, and I believe it's quite effective if other countries in the Pacific can also share the same. If they share the same view, is to partake in the political systems and support young generational leaders coming forward to contest the elections and having their voice heard in Parliament.
Yeah, that's great, Amanda. I think, bringing young voices to Parliament is incredibly important. Lee, what are your thoughts about this in terms of the US? How might we, motivate and encourage young people to run for office here?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I was a young candidate myself. When I won my local election, I was 19 years old, and it wasn't easy. And this is something I think as America we could do better at. And it's actually something I'm really proud to see that we are having more women. To my understanding, more women are running for office this year in America than ever before, which I think is absolutely fantastic. I was raised by a single mom. I promise you, if Congress was full of women like my mom, a lot more would get done. They wouldn't even need to be in session year round. But just thinking about some of the barriers that are for young people. And I think it's important we acknowledge these barriers, and then we can kind of think about some ways to work around them. But thinking about running for office usually takes up a lot of time, and everybody but you, the candidate, gets paid. So there's definitely a financial hurdle. There's a time hurdle. Usually young people are less connected in their community, as in a sense, whether it's financially trying to solicit donations, or just well-connected and know the right people. But what I do want to say is, as important as it is to vote, and I would always encourage people to run for office, there are definitely more ways to get involved. It doesn't end on election day, and it doesn't end if you're not a member. I contact my local elected officials all of the time. They know who I am. They know who what's important to me, and they know that I vote. And another way too is, if you don't want to run, you can serve on staff. If we were to walk through the halls of the United States Congress, most of these congressional offices would be run by people who are in their mid-20s, early to mid-20s. So yeah, it might not be their name on the ballot, and they might not be the one in the news, but they're still involved every day in the public policy process. So I think, if a touchdown is getting more young people elected to local office, I'm all for that. But I don't think we should rule out the field goal of just getting more people involved in the public policy process. And I think back to what you said earlier, Ashley, with just more young people voting and young people being a larger share of the electorate is a really great place to start.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm glad you brought up barriers, because absolutely, I don't think we can talk about strategies without sort of acknowledging these barriers that do exist. And thinking about one of the other barriers being political apathy and disillusionment and a lack of trust in the political process and political leaders. And so, this is going to be a tough question, but how might we do some relationship building with these political actors and young people to help build that trust and those relationships that would empower young people and motivate them to participate more in the electoral process? And Madelaine, maybe I'll oh.
No, that's just fine. That's just fine. That works for me.
Yeah. Sure. I think some great ways to do not just voting, but, elected leaders love to, Lee was talking about how he contacts his officials all the time. I do too. Building those relationships, are very important. I think a lot of young people don't realize how important it is to create advocacy campaigns and things like that, where you're targeting your local officials, where you're targeting your senators. And it actually is very easy to, get a meeting with them. So you can actually sit down and talk with one of their, staffers and really have a one-on-one conversation about the issues that are important to you. And then you can take that and translate it on campus and create a bigger movement around that. And I think what is really important, and what we're seeing with a lot of some of these youth movements, is how we are using that process and, engaging with our elected officials. But I think, trust really needs to be built by them listening to the younger generation as well. We have a lot of great thoughts. We are now, as we've talked about, a large majority of the electorate, and these politicians can no longer afford to not listen to us. And it is really a great time to be a young person in America, because our voices, I think, are more powerful than ever. We just have to figure out how to hone that and, make it loud and big and push them to want to work with us.
Yeah, Madelaine, those are great points. And Lee, we'll go back to you, because I know you're eager to touch on this again.
No, I was just afraid you were waiting for me. I think there's kind of different schools of thought. Part of it is, when I got involved locally, there were a lot of people who were just really happy to see a young person involved, for sure. So I feel there was a lot of support, and I had done quite a bit in my community. So I will say, if you're a young person and you want to run for office, usually that's not where it starts. It starts 2 to 5 years before that, when you're already involved in your community, you know a little bit about it. And that involvement could be different. For me, some of my biggest involvement, I was a volunteer track coach for like the 14 and under team. So I knew people, just some things like that. So I'd say there's one school of thought, but also don't be afraid to not to wait your turn. especially that's something I can give advice to young people. And I think that seeing, especially in congressional primaries or just primaries around the country, just different elections, people, they want to get involved and they are done waiting their turn for the person who's been in that office for 10 or 20 years or longer just to retire. And that age-old saying, if you want to make an omelet, sometimes you got to crack a few eggs. So don't be afraid to do that. It doesn't always work out, but hey, that's okay. At least we learned a few things. But those are really two things that I've done. But also building trust. I think, one of the social media is a double-edged sword. Where there's just a lot of disinformation, whether it's through social media or just not people knowing in general. I have seen that lack of knowledge usually puts fear, whether it's into an institution, whether it's, I don't really know how to vote, so I don't want to do it, or where it's just about like the government and how it's set up as a whole. So one of my ways is to really build trust is to showing up, but also learning about what's going on, because sometimes things do make more sense when you learn about the background. But I think Madelaine hit the nail on the head when she talked about bringing more people together. It is really easy, or should be easy, to get a meeting with your local elected official. And if it's not easy, then it should be easy to replace them.
Yeah, Lee, I think those are, great points about community involvement and don't wait your turn. I love that. Amanda, we've obviously met in person over a few different trips that I've taken to Bougainville. And, obviously I've witnessed Bougainville. There's a lot of grassroots efforts and community efforts to sort of mobilize young voters. And I wonder, as you were campaigning and what you're seeing with some of your colleagues, what are some of the ways that we can, continue the community building and relationship building once someone gets elected into office? What might be some of the ways that you can do that in Bougainville, or you are doing that in Bougainville?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I don't know if you can hear me, but one of the important tool and the key to building confidence on for the people to support you, having a good relationship with the community and people in the government system, and also politicians, where you start to build trust and confidence in you. When because I already had connections community through my previous role. So the politicians that were in government at the time, when I went out for campaign, although I had funding with on the people that I know that were also contesting, that meant that I had to work with politicians, I had to work with not in the seat that I was the open seats at the open seats, where because of the experience and the work that I did previously, they kind of trusted me and knew my potential, that they all went and supported me in ensuring that I got the seat. And I believe relationship with the community, especially your voters, goes a long way to you being elected into parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. Amanda, you touched on another important aspect, I think, that I'd like to sort of expand upon. It's not just community involvement, but it's really leaning on our allies, right? So the family relationships that we have, the relationships we have with community leaders who can support us with building skills or support us in other ways to get to where we want to get in terms of, the type of participation that we want to achieve in the political process. So either running for candidacy or getting involved in voter education campaigns. It's really leaning on the community and your allies within who can help sort of make those connections. So relationship building is key to a lot of this process. And I am sorry to say, but we have run out of time. I just want to offer maybe 30 seconds to each of you if you would like to make sort of, one last note or comment towards either young leaders or election administrators in terms of bolstering youth participation in the electoral process. Lee, any final thoughts from you?
So I guess my last final thoughts are, decisions are made by those who show up. So, if you care, you are obligated to get involved, and at the very, very least, go out there and vote and bring a friend with you. But like I said, the Leadership Institute has an international trainings department. So you can always email me. It's just ljackson@leadershipinstitute.org, and we can do what we can to set something up. But finally, like I said, decisions are made by those who show up. So start by voting and just go from there.
Great. Thank you, Lee. Madelaine, any final thoughts?
Sure. I mean, wow, I thought I had a thought. Now I'm sorry. I think, you really just build on those relationships and decide on which route you want to go. Do you want to be a candidate? Do you want to be a political activist? Do you want to be, a staffer? And I think you really just, as a young person, you have to think about, do you really want a seat at the table? How badly do you want that seat at the table? And what relationships and connections can you make to get that seat?
Yeah, that's great. And Amanda, any final thoughts from Bougainville?
Just for the youth who want to create change and want to impact on how the society works and all those issues that we have, just keep on talking and keep on doing the good things that you do, because one day people who recognize you, they see the potential in you being involved in the process, and that's where your voice gets to be heard. Yeah, thank you.
Great, Amanda, I'll echo that sentiment. Keep on talking, keep on doing, keep on taking action. So thank you all for a great discussion. I want to thank you, Madelaine, Amanda, Lee, for your words of wisdom, for your recommendations, and the many tools that you all shared today. Thank you, Vasu, for your opening remarks, and many thanks to the team behind the scenes for support with event logistics today. And thank you very much to our audience for participating in this discussion and sharing these great questions. We hope you are taking away some key lessons for future efforts, and we appreciate you being with us today. Next Monday, November 2nd at 8 a.m. Eastern, our U.S. election program activities will kick off again with remarks from IFES's president and CEO, Tony Bambury, IFES's board co-chair, Tad Devine, and IFES's vice chair, June DeHart. And will be followed by more panel discussions on the U.S. elections, including a live forecast on Election Day, which we all know is coming up. So remember to visit www.usep.ifes.org to continue the conversation and engage with IFES's youth programming all year round by following our Twitter handle @IFESYouth. And finally, before we close, I'd like to remind our audience that IFES is a 501c3 organization funded in part by the US government with a bipartisan board of directors and a nonpartisan organizational identity. And we do provide apolitical democracy and elections assistance. This work is made possible by the generous support of the American people through the United States Agency for International Development and other supporters. The content associated with this event does not necessarily reflect the views of USAID or our sponsors, nor do the opinions expressed reflect the views or opinions of IFES. Thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you, panelists, for your words. Hope to see you next week at our event on Monday. Have a good day.